Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Nguyen, and I am your host. Great to be here with you all. We are going to spend some time today to circle back to a topic that is gaining popularity every day. I think I saw something online, maybe it was a post on Instagram that said that from a study of a popularized poll that over 8 million people may have tried psychedelics in the past year. And of that, almost 70% of folks did so via microdosing. And so today we will be talking about microdosing psychedelics and giving you all a little bit of a step by step guide on some of the best practices that we have accumulated over the past several years in helping thousands of folks move through intentional psychedelic experiences through our programs here at Psychedelic Passage. And so as we learn more things over time, we continually try to update with information that we will share here with our audience. You've seen or probably listened to some episodes from us in the past about, how should I microdose or macrodose in my experience? What are considerations of microdosing after a large dose experience? And we've certainly done versions of this episode in the past, but with psychedelics being essentially outlawed over the past 60 or 70 so years, we have a real big gap in research. We have a real big gap in understanding. And where we find ourselves today is that more and more folks are turning to psychedelics as an alternative or an adjunct to their own therapeutic practices. And what I find is that microdosing is a really great entry point, to that. And so what we'll do today is we'll spend a little time doing a quick primer about microdosing, what it is, different reasons, just the parameters that you might need to know there. And then we'll move into some conversations about prepping microdoses. We'll talk a little bit about cadence, frequency, timing. We'll talk about documenting and tracking data. And then we'll also talk about the importance of getting ongoing support in this whole thing. By the end of this, I hope that anybody who is listening to this, whether you're psychedelic curious or well seasoned with psychedelic use, that you have a few takeaways that might be helpful for you as you explore your own process in microdosing, if that feels like something that's on your radar. And so I think what might be helpful is to just give a little bit of a quick primer. Many folks already know this, but I think it's important to talk about, what is microdosing in the context of psychedelic use. And the idea with microdosing, we all know about, hallucinogenic trips and big altered states of consciousness when you are consuming enough psychedelic substance to actually elicit a psychedelic state. The idea with microdosing is that you are taking small increments of a psychedelic substance, usually like a 20th or a 30th or even sometimes a 50th of what would constitute a macro dose. And you are doing so in a way to try to achieve some different but maybe overlapping objectives as it relates to an intentional larger dose psychedelic experience. The other thing that's worth noting is that microdosing is, I don't want to relegate it just to this, but as far as like frequency, it is more like taking a vitamin. It's something that you are likely doing several times a week or depending on a cadence that's right for you. But with microdosing, you're taking small incremental dosages of a psychedelic substance to achieve some type of an effect. That's like the broad way that'll share it. There's different reasons for that. I think that not only there's individuals who approach exploring, who approach in the exploration of psychedelics for a variety of different reasons. You've heard me share many times on this podcast that there's folks who look at this from a religious aspect, a cultural aspect, a mental health perspective, folks who look at this from a personal growth perspective. And so there's certainly within that realm a lot of different reasons why somebody might consider microdosing. What we see today is that there are many folks who do look at this from a mental health lens, but the picture that I want to paint here is that the decision of engaging with psychedelics is certainly a big decision, and I think one that encompasses a lot of different dimensions within that choice. Primarily, what we're seeing with psychedelics is that it becomes a really intriguing accompaniment to supporting folks in their mental health endeavors. If I can zoom out from that, I think there can be a number of different pathways to that. So like processing your emotions, getting a little bit of support with your own maybe symptoms of, let's say, if you're dealing with anxiety or depression or trauma processing or grief or a number of those things. There's also a school of thought of people who are using psychedelics and microdosing psychedelics, particularly for like performance enhancement, whether at work or whatever. But I think the general theme here, regardless of whether you're looking at this from a mental health lens or otherwise, is that the general theme I find is that folks who are seeking microdosing of psychedelics to do so to increase their capacity in some way, shape, or form. Now, what I want to share here and what I think is important for me to name is that my personal belief is that if you are just looking at using psychedelics just for its benefits, then you're probably just limiting your scope of the possibility of not only what these substances can do for you, but also the larger relationship that you may have with plant medicines or fungi medicines. And so, what I like to think about is something that I've shared in episodes before, which I particularly draw this from my influence in, I call it like the medicine ways, the indigenous ways of looking at psychedelic use or substance use in general, which to me, this is actually about using psychedelics to build a relationship with yourself. And in that regard, you then therefore have this opportunity to build a relationship with psychedelics. And so if you are building a relationship with psychedelics, that can actually create a bridge for you to possibly build a relationship with yourself. Because at the end of the day, regardless of if you're looking at this to alleviate a symptom, if you're looking at this to show up more efficiently or whatever at work, universally within all of that relies this internal relationship, this internal processing. There's still this you that sits in there that is so, so important. I don't want folks to overlook that just because they're looking towards the benefits of microdosing or whatnot. And so I just want to provide a little bit more of a holistic look at the intersection of psychedelic substances and humans, which has likely spanned back for probably thousands and thousands of years. I think the other important thing as I'm thinking about the influence of, our ancestors who have engaged with psychedelics in a meaningful way is that one of the really important aspects of, the indigenous ways or the medicine ways of harnessing psychedelics is that this is not just about self-service. I think really the key here is, how do I do my own internal work? How do I do my own self-improvement so that I can return back and positively impact my world, those that I love, my community, and those around me? So if I look at it from that lens, sure, we can say, oh, microdosing helps to alleviate XYZ symptom, or, if I microdose, I find myself to be more energetic or have more stress resilience or have more, whatever your intention is. But if I can boil it down, if I'm really thinking about the art behind microdosing, I think it comes down to having a pathway to do a couple of things at its core, which benefit all the other stuff that I'm talking about. Those things are tuning into the art of noticing, tuning into the art of attunement, the art of being present. And I think what is actually the most profound is having the ability to view things from a different and alternate perspective. And so, what do I mean about the art of noticing and the art of being present? Well, there's so much stimuli happening in our world. There's so many things that we need to do just to function as humans in our society, where I find that microdosing has this really, really beautiful aspect of, helping us to do a little bit more noticing, especially when I'm thinking about psilocybin, microdosing psilocybin. I think that this internal noticing is one of the most important aspects around this. And then the art of attunement means, given what's happening with me in the present moment, here's how I can attune my state of being. Here's how I can attune the choices and decisions that I'm doing, right? And so people look at this in a lot of different ways. Like, people call it getting into a flow state, or mindfulness, practices, and a wide range of things. But I just want to draw this connection that I don't believe that microdosing psilocybin or LSD, which are the two, primary things, should really just come down to benefits. Obviously, today we're going to get a little bit more tangible. We're going to get actionable, as you know that I love to do. I love to share functional advice around this world, because our goal here at Psychedelics is how to empower people to have meaningful and hopefully safer and more productive, conversations and experiences with psychedelics. But I want to add this larger lens. And if there's anything here that is inspiring a curiosity or a question for our audience and listeners about, what is the real reason why I'm doing this? I hope that what I'm sharing here can, enrich your own internal dialogue and decision making process. As I mentioned before, and we're going to move a little bit more into the functional aspects of this podcast, is that, as I mentioned, there right now there's probably two main substances that individuals are microdosing with. One is psilocybin-containing mushrooms, and the other one is LSD. In our society here in America, those are some of the few like classic psychedelics, which means that they have been in our modern history for, almost 60, 70 years. Within psilocybin mushrooms, it's important to note that there are different strains, and also within those, 200 different species of psilocybin containing mushrooms, there's different potency levels, and there are different concentrations of psilocybin and psilocin that probably range and vary within the biomass of the actual dried mushroom. The other thing that's important to note here is that, due to the lack of study and research because of the prohibition and the war on drugs, is that there's likely other constituents in there that will affect your experience. LSD is a little bit of a different substance, meaning that primarily what we are finding with LSD that is prevalent and available in society today is that these are man-made synthetic derivatives of what was originally developed from an ergot fungus that Albert Hoffman had discovered and synthesized way back. And you can look this up. That's called Bicycle Day, and there's a whole history about LSD there too. I think if we're looking at LSD, which is a little bit harder to find, that's why most people are leaning towards psilocybin mushrooms as an entry point to microdosing. LSD is pretty interesting because it depends on the source, it depends on the maker of it. Obviously, these substances are still federally illegal substances. And so the whole reason why I bring this up is that if you are going to choose to microdose, it does require a level of harm reduction here. One of the main tenets of harm reduction being that you have the substance that you think that you have, and you have the right mechanisms to test those substances, test for adulterants, test for potency. And one thing that's been really cool is we built a relationship with this organization called Miraculix, and they have developed a couple of different things. Primarily one product for different substances called Q-Test. Q-Test becoming the first publicly available at-home potency test that can really tell you the strength and impact of whatever that particular psychedelic substance is. This, of course, applies to macrodoses as well, but you can see how this is massively important in microdosing. Previous to this, you used to have to, have big machinery, mass spectrometers and chromatography, devices and FTIRs and a number of these things to test in a laboratory. But now you have that power of information in your hands. So we recorded 2 podcast episodes with Dr. Felix Bly, and I would invite you all, if you're curious, you can go listen to that and hear me nerding out about all things, mushrooms. But what's more important, and we have all of these links in our bio and then also through our website, is the ability to get the Q tests so that you can get a range of potency across your substance. I think this is the most important, and I'm going to be focusing primarily on psilocybin mushrooms because, as I mentioned, this is the most prevalent out in our society today due to accessibility. But just knowing that these different concentrations of psilocybin and psilocin range across strain, but it also ranges across batch. It ranges across cultivation methods. Psilocybin and psilocin can degrade over time, so it ranges across a timeline depending on how you're storing your substance and whatnot. And so there's a lot of variables here, and you can see how that creates a pretty interesting thing to navigate. Let's say if you feel like you've dialed in your dosage and are getting the effect and the relationship with psychedelics that you want, and then you go back a month later to the same batch, you're like, something feels different. Well, now you have some data. Now you have some information. One of the cool things that I'll plug is Dr. Felix Bly and his team also have a reporting portal where folks can actually report their experiences with different strains in, different formats of use. And all of that type of community research actually helps to inform the public discourse and the availability of knowledge out there as far as these strains and their different, potencies. So definitely check out those episodes. And I think that there was like a massive, massive wealth of information there. I certainly learned a lot there. So one thing that I want to note before we get into some more of the tangible aspects is that over the past, let's call it like 5 to 7 years, the way that microdoses were being described is that you are taking sub-perceptual amounts of a psychedelic substance to achieve some effect. That certainly confused a lot of people because they were like, well, how do I know if I have an effect or not? If it's sub-perceptual, if it is below the threshold of perceiving or below the threshold of feeling. Totally ironic there, or a little bit of a conundrum for people, especially folks who are newly exploring psychedelics. A term that I think is actually way more appropriate, which I really like, is actually that instead of it being sub-perceptual, it's actually sub-psychedelic, which means that there is a range of dosage there where you are still in your own function and general state of sobriety that is prior to the psychedelic experience. So I think that is actually the better explanation of what a microdose is. It's actually engaging with the psychedelic substance at a level of dosage and at a frequency that is sub-psychedelic. And I really love that because it gives you a lot of flexibility on what that means. When I'm looking at, the range of microdosing psilocybin, for example, and I'm talking about full dried biomass of a mushroom, a microdose can probably range anywhere from 50 milligrams up to 800 milligrams, depending on the individual, depending on their medication history, depending on their tolerance or sensitivity to psychedelic substances or substances in general. And so you can see how that's actually quite a wide range for many, individuals. So I just wanted to share that little bit about sub psychedelic there as we move on to these other topics in our podcast today. So, as it is in the name of intentional psychedelic use, I think that whatever your reasoning is, it's definitely very important for you to set an intention because this will certainly be the North Star or the guidepost upon which you can properly document and properly assess whether you are moving towards those intentions or not. So, just to speak about that a little bit, is that one of the really important things about microdosing psychedelics is that you have to have a good system for tracking and documenting. So I always recommend for individuals to determine the variables that are most important to them, establish a baseline, and then track those variables over time. Because what I see with folks as far as taking incremental dosages of psychedelics is that likely the changes that you are going to experience is also incremental, right? So, what I share with folks is that a trend requires at least two data points. And then if you actually have more data points over time, you can really see the nuance of actually what's happening. And so I might say, for example, that one of the variabilities that I want to track is the ability to have more emotional regulation and stress resilience. Well, there's a lot of stuff that happens in life, and my ability to cope emotionally or my ability to get back to a grounded, centered state will probably vary depending on the day. But if I'm tracking this over time, then I actually get to see and discern whether a microdose is actually helping with that or not, or if the dosage that I'm at actually helps to move towards that intention or not. So I think that starting at that baseline is certainly really, really important. What I'll do is talk a little bit about prepping, microdoses, and obviously for this, I'm going to focus on psilocybin mushrooms. What I'll say is that it's 2024, and what we're seeing is that the availability of accessing psychedelics has become more and more prevalent over time. Again, disclaimer, federally illegal substances, you have to operate in your own risk tolerance to what's right for you, your loved ones, your needs. And so I just want to share for folks to just be safe out there. And I think that if you were going to engage in psychedelic use, it's also important, as I said, to make sure that the substance that you think you have is a substance that you actually have in your possession. There are certainly a lot of vendors out there where you can purchase your own microdoses that are preset for you. There's also folks who cultivate their own, especially with psilocybin. There's also folks who go out and forage. So there's a variety of different things. And my main point is that however you source, so what's really important here is for you to have a really sterile and clean environment as you are preparing your own microdoses. So any instruments and tools that you use, the surfaces that you use, washing your hands, maybe using nitrile or latex gloves. You may also need some other gear like a jeweler scale. When we're talking about microdosing psilocybin, we're talking about milligrams, not grams and ounces. So your regular kitchen scale will not work here, but usually we talk about a jeweler scale. And to me, I think what's important is that a scale that goes out into at least 3 decimal points. So we're talking about tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. And if you find a scale that can help you measure into the thousands, that is really helpful. All of these scales have different variants and different sensitivities. These are very sensitive tools. And so it's also important. I mean, some people have, multiple scales, or that you're calibrating your scale, pretty regularly. Some of the things that we've learned is that, when we're talking about psilocybin mushrooms, using a homogenized blend is really important. So if you do have full dried mushrooms, the concentrations that are found in a cap is different than the concentration that's found in the stem. So what we find for folks is that grinding all of this up into a powder or blend can be very important. Now, what we learned in our conversation from Dr. Felix Bly is that once you start to grind down biomass, it is less stable. Generally safe, but what we're talking about is it's going to start to degrade and lose its potency. So one word of advice is probably not to grind or pre-grind too far in advance. I think that if you had the availability and the best practice was to grind maybe weekly, Some folks are, relegated to, grinding up their capsules or whatnot for a month or so. It's just something that you should consider. You got to find a process that works the best for you. A quick note is that if you are working with LSD, again, very hard to source in this format, but likely if you're going to titrate to effect for your dose, that's probably going to come in a liquid format. And what I see generally people doing is using LSD drops or a spray, like an oral spray, and they are diluting LSD along with either distilled water or Everclear so that you can have that right concentration. It's important to note that LSD is measured in micrograms, not milligrams. So, in order higher there, a very, very minute measurement there. And so, what that says is that a small quantity of LSD actually can go quite a long way. What I'm seeing with LSD is that a common macro dose is anywhere from, let's call it, 100 micrograms up to 150, maybe 200. And then what I see there as far as microdoses will range somewhere between 12 to 30 micrograms that might be helpful. So my biggest advice here is do your math, check it twice, make sure that you are being really diligent and thorough, document, write this stuff down. I think if we're talking about preparing microdoses, otherwise, particularly for psilocybin mushrooms, one thing that I want to call out is that a very popular aspect of this is stacking, which means that you are using other nootropics, other functional mushrooms, other functional plants, in addition to your microdose for its synergistic effect. So if we are looking to psychedelics for its benefits and knowledge and wisdom, these fungi and plants, one thing that I want to share is that that's really just the tip of the iceberg. There are many other functional plants, mushrooms, teacher plants, wisdom plants that are out there that can help our human experience, most of which are legal and non-psychedelic. If we're talking about functional mushrooms, there's certainly quite a range of them, lion's mane, turkey tail, reishi, cordyceps, chaga, to name a few. I think if we're looking at functional plants, I'm certainly a little bit more of a novice here as far as my expertise, but there's a whole world of herbalism out there that can be certainly helpful for you. One of the things that we're getting ready to publish soon is actually our functional guide to modern day mushrooms, which will include these non-psychedelic mushrooms as well as psychedelic ones. So be on the lookout for that. Another topic that I think is really important is just to talk through the cadency, frequency, and timing of microdosing. What I'll share here is that there's different protocols. There are a few different ones: Fadiman's protocol, the Stamets protocol, a number of other ones. Everybody's developing their own protocols, but basically, what this is saying is that there should be a variability on your on and off days, meaning that there are certain days where you are microdosing and other days where you are taking a break or taking a rest. This helps with, building tolerance and resilience, or like, substance resilience there. But I think also this helps with like tracking baseline, because I think because these are very incremental changes to your system, having these off days actually helps you to notice what's different. And I think that that's massively, massively helpful there. Nighttime versus daytime dosage, I think, is also important. I think that there was originally a school of thought where your microdoses should start off at the beginning of the day. Now there are some folks who anecdotally share, hey, I get a little sleepy, I get a little tired when I'm microdosing psilocybin. So there's been a new kind of wave of nighttime dosage. I think that actually something else that's actually pretty compelling is taking multiple doses throughout your dosing day. So this might be, taking a certain dosage to start off. Let's just say in this example, 100 milligrams, and then you might follow up a couple of hours later with 50 milligrams, knowing that each of these dosages have like an active effect. Like with psilocybin, I see that ranging somewhere around 4 to 6 hours of effect, and then there's usually this like lingering kind of like afterglow. And then just knowing that you also have an onset time. depending on if you've eaten, depending on if you've had any caffeine that day, a number of these things that will affect your onset time, which I think probably ranges anywhere from 15 to 45 minutes. And, what I'll share is that when we're talking about these small, small dosages, that it's really important to increment and experiment. Don't be afraid to experiment. The difference of 25 milligrams or 50 milligrams can actually make a noticeable difference for you. So let's say, for example, that you have a goal of being more tapped in and tuned into your emotions and your emotional regularity, as I shared before. Well, at 100 milligrams, you might not notice anything, but at 150 milligrams of psilocybin mushrooms, you actually might notice, oh wow, like there's actually a difference where I'm like tuning in and feeling my emotions. But maybe at 200 milligrams, it's too intense. You're too overwhelmed, right? This is particularly true when you're using microdosing for like performance enhancement, like getting into a flow state, or using psilocybin for, work related things or productivity related things, where you might think, oh, I'm going to take more so that I can have a greater effect. And then you start processing emotions and feelings and trauma that you're not ready for in the middle of your workday, as an example. And so it's important to know that your dosage is going to depend on your intention and your intended output. And then also just to know that these small increments make a difference. So I even personally notice in my own, LSD microdosing, that the difference between 12 and 25, or let's say 15 and 30 micrograms, certainly massively, massively different. I think the other thing that's worth, mentioning too, is that we all have different sensitivities here, and it's also certainly going to range on the day and what we have, going on there in our lives. I think as I'm talking about, like taking a break in the cadence and frequency and timing too, I think it's also important that you take, longer breaks periodically. So I find myself wanting to take breaks of maybe a month off, or 2 or 3, weeks, or 2 weeks here or 1 week here. One of the beautiful things about, microdosing is that there's very little withdrawal effect. So you can really start and stop your microdoses without too much interruption to what you have going on in your life. So what I'll share is that I'm kind of giving you the broad strokes here. I'm giving you the highlights of what I think is important as far as starting the dialogue of how to microdose. The cool thing is that a lot of this has been accumulated from the many, many years that we have learned good lessons and best practices when we've supported other individuals through microdose and macrodose programs. One of the biggest takeaways that I have is that even with a microdose, even if you're having these little incremental like feelings and effects, that you still need to integrate and you still need to have accountability. And this is especially true, what I'm about to say, for folks who are newer to psychedelics or have not had, psychedelic experiences in the past, is that I really recommend that you should get professional support. Sure, there's people who can do it yourself or DIY out there. But when you are dealing with matters of the heart, matters of the soul, matters of the spirit, matters of the mind, oftentimes it's helpful for you to get a little bit of support. I think that there's three main reasons why somebody would, engage in some type of professional support with microdosing psychedelics. One is that as you're experimenting and establishing a baseline and finding the right ideal dosage for you, you can make adjustments in real time by getting good advice from a professional. One of the most common things that I see when I've done my own microdose coaching, or support, or have supported other folks in microdosing, is folks just don't know what's normal or not. They're like, is it common for me to have more vivid dreams? Is it common for me to have this effect with my sleep? Is it common for me to feel this nuance and difference in my energy levels or my appetite? And a microdose coach who is really well versed can be able to help you discern, oh, what's normal or not, or at least what's common across a pool of different psychedelic users. The second reason is that it's really important just to have somebody to process with. Now, remember, with microdosing or psychedelics in general, it's about taking the content from our unconscious and moving it into our consciousness so that we can better effectively navigate and deal and heal from those things, right? That applies to microdosing as well. So very often I find that microdosing brings up content in which it's helpful to bring to your psychedelic coach or bring to your psychedelic friendly, therapist as an example, which then leads into a third reason why it's important to get professional support is that it's helpful to just be in community. That's where the accountability thing kicks in as well. If you have an avenue and a format where you're sharing information, where you're sharing your anecdotes, where you're sharing what's going on with you, not only do you have people who see you and support you, being witnessed in this process is actually massively important, but also there's a level of being supported in community, which actually I think is one of the biggest pillars of psychedelic use and psychedelic work. So I know I threw a whole bunch of information at you. And don't worry if you have not absorbed that all, you can go back and listen to this episode. But certainly this is like a surface level description of microdosing. The cool thing is that our team has got this all documented and written down for you. So there's a couple of different ways that you can explore engaging in our support here at Psychedelic Passage. One is we have a 40-page microdose guide that you can get the digital PDF from, the ebook, and learn and really dive into all of these topics. In there, there's journal logs, and it really gets into the nitty-gritty of a lot of what I discussed today. We also offer that in a microdose bundle, which comes with a number of other digital assets, which people find helpful too. If we're looking at different programs, what we've developed here is that individuals can seek one-on-one microdose coaching. This usually happens over a period of 4 to 6 weeks where you're having like virtual coaching sessions at regular intervals. And very soon we will be introducing microdose cohorts, which will be a grouping of microdosers who are led by a facilitator so that you can really emphasize that communal aspect here as well. So, our goal here at Psychedelic Passage is to support safer, more meaningful psychedelic experiences. And so if any of those pathways resonate with you, I really invite you to reach out to us so that we can potentially be a better service. It would be a great honor to explore your needs and help you get to, where you want to go. So that wraps up our episode here today. I hope that was, helpful and valuable to the listeners here. What I want to do as we wrap up every episode is take some time to read a testimonial. This testimonial, I know that today was about microdosing, but the one that I thought was really compelling here is about a large dose experience. And this is actually about our facility. We have a female facilitator in the Oregon area. And it says, "My experience with this facilitator was wonderful from start to finish. In the preparatory Zoom meetings, they were engaging, fun, well organized, and demonstrated a depth of knowledge about the ceremonial work we planned to do together. When I arrived at their place for the ceremony, I felt full confidence that they would be a good guide for me. My trust proved well founded. This facilitator held every aspect of the ceremonial experience expertly, with grace and a good spirit. Looking back on the experience, I say to myself that it could not have gone any better." And the facilitator's experience and history and knowledge was a big part of that. I'm very grateful to have worked with her. I acknowledge that not every psychedelic experience is predictable. There's a lot of different nuance to this work. And I'm really, really grateful that our work here at Psychedelic Passage is creating a portal, creating a pathway for folks to connect to services and support that is right for them. So big gratitude, big thanks. Thank you to all of our listeners. Thank you to our community. I'm sending a lot of love to anybody considering intentional psychedelic work. And I look forward to seeing you next time.